So, Harold, thank you for being here. I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about your work as an artist, and also, I know you're an academic. I know you teach a little bit at Leeds and also other places in London. And I thought maybe you could talk a little bit about the work and how it relates back to art and how it sort of relates back to the anti-racism imperative and just to the wider project.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me. I feel a bit sort of reticent about following Calwant. It's kind of like, what do you say? Brilliant, really just brilliant. Just want to kind of acknowledge that. But also, thank you for kind of opening up this space, a kind of conversation. It's interesting, yeah. I mean, my practice for those very brief for those people that don't know, I guess it's very process driven. I think increasingly I'm just sort of defining it through ideas of kind of curiosity and learning. I think for me it's very much there's a kind of structure that I've created for myself, which is a framework for learning and investigation and speculation and curiosity. And often that's been driven through, I think, trying to find different ways of inquiring and engaging with the world, so often thinking through not just the kind of primacy of kind of language and text, but also thinking about the body, thinking about the sensory, and I think, like many people, Black people, people of colour, who've had encounters with institutions, those encounters have sort of shaped often the terms in which I've had to kind of operate, and the sense in which that, strategies maybe have had to be kind of developed to tackle and deal with, those systemic forms of kind of oppression and prejudice and institutional colonialism that are sort of baked into all of these kind of structures. And again, I think I sort of turned to my practice, or used my practice as a kind of conduit for kind of exploring some of these questions and trying to kind of make connections and establish kind of conversations. So I mean, it's often difficult. I mean, anyone can just go onto my website and find my work, so I won't necessarily talk too much about like a kind of whole history, but certainly something that I'm very invested in is like histories and narratives, because I feel that is really, like, I feel like I'm having conversations all the time where there's an absence of an understanding of historical narratives and legacies. And there are often these huge disparities between, and again, I hear myself saying this and it makes me sound like, I'm, again, putting myself over other people, but it's kind of, I've, just through my own curiosity, have explored certain historical narratives that I feel have shaped my life, that, and, I think, from what we heard from Calwan, I think, there is a white supremacist structure that we all live in that means that, lots of white people don't know about their history, or there's a particular framing of that. So it means you're constantly, like, for example, like, I've had constant conversations about, EDI, equality, diversity, inclusion. And it's like, you can't actually have that conversation unless we're able to really have an honest conversation about the histories and legacies that inform that. Otherwise, you're just talking about completely different things. And Calwan said that much more clearly than I'm saying it. But I think that's something that I feel very strongly is a driver, as a motivation within my practice and the way in which I work situationally, whether that's with historical archives and museum materials or artifacts, or whether that's in my teaching work, and facilitating and collaborating in conversations in that shared learning space that can be really the utopian space of, if you know, the art school or of a kind of education that is almost sits parasitically within this, yeah, white supremacist university kind of sort of structure. And I mean, I also just really want to acknowledge, you know, the publication of Particular Reality. I just think it's, again, for me, that is an example of a kind of insurgent utopian space that's kind of opened up, maybe counter to the university or in spite of the university, or but is sort of driven by the urgent need and desire from students and artists, educators, to really address questions that institutions continually fail or refuse to really engage with. So yeah, I mean, that's just to sort of frame a little things. I mean, I'm aware that, you know, I'm sort of responding to this idea of art, you know, these three imperatives I think that you sort of set out. And in some ways, I think it's the kind of like, I think often in my work, I'm aware that I'm really dealing with the problem of art, the word, and also its cultural conception, its history, its etymology. So again, you know, I always find it completely anachronistic that I've been teaching for the last 13 years on a course at Leeds Beckett University that is called Fine Art. You're going to do a degree in what the hell does that mean? That it doesn't actually really reflect, if I think about the kind of like history of that word and how embedded it is within a kind of European post-Enlightenment kind of sort of discourse that frames particular knowledges around and privileges certain aesthetics, is deeply invested in a particular conception of art's role within culture and society, and aestheticization, rarefication, elitism of culture. That's fine art, you know. It's kind of, and I often have this sort of debate really about, like, I mean, I'm again like one of these kind of annoying lefty people where it's like, what is we need new words, like we need, you know, and for me that's a useful process. You can easily get distracted with that, but I think for me it's really important that we're constantly testing and contesting these structures, these frames that we have to kind of sort of operate within, and I think it can be useful as a process for binding a community, or binding or gaining a sense of solidarity, you know. So I have almost like this kind of dream of, like, with each cohort that sort of joins the institution, it's like, okay, we need to find a new name for it. What is this thing that we're doing? Because, like, you know, this thing that is called art actually comes with this baggage, with this expectation, with, is that actually what we are aligning ourselves with, you know? So if it's not, what are our shared values? What are our motivating forces? What are our desires? What do we want to be opened up from this process of sharing this space and time together? And how do we name that? Because to me, I mean, I think there are some intrinsic component parts of art. For me, it is it's there is a balance between the process, and for me that process is always reflective, and is always one that is ultimately about learning and education, because it's an investigation, it's an open question, it's speculative, it's inherently speculative. But I think what's also useful, and sometimes more, and this is the more problematic side of it, is the sharing, is the presentation, is the encounter with audience, so that going beyond perhaps that what might be a sort of personal investigation or a collaborative kind of question, it's at that point in which things become public, and the politics of public and audience, is also a necessary part of art. I mean, but it's at that point where art then encounters things like the market, and things can be commodified. And I'm not saying I'm necessarily per se against those things. They have their place and their space, and we all exist within a capitalist economic framework where we all have to try and sort of survive and live. But in the production of things, which I think is necessary within art as part of disseminating and sharing and then feeding back into those processes and speculations. So for me, there are these kind of dual sort of aspects, which is the kind of the things that we call the making, the speculation, the curiosity, and the various outcomes, which we might see as discretely just specific outcomes, or I try to think about as just another steps in the process. But ultimately, I think what is problematic is that, is this thing that we don't, when we use the word art, I think we're speaking different languages often. And there is always this kind of huge disconnect. And so I was really thinking about the process of you collectively making a particular reality, and really how, in a way, and again, I haven't been sort of part of that process. It's really nice to look at that document, and I'd really recommend, if people haven't had a chance to really kind of like submerge themselves in it, the kind of poetry, the images. It also, for me, represents a kind of, not in a didactic way, but a kind of manual, in the way that we all need models to help us locate ourselves. So there is an invitation to institutions, to groups of young people, to artist educators, to really think about, can we take on an opportunity to kind of create a conversation and shape a framework for a conversation, both in and out, or adjunct or parallel to institutions, organizations that, we may feel are problematic or repressive. So even within that, I was thinking about it as an artwork, and thinking about it was making me think about, how does this define in relation to art? And in many ways, those things that I was talking about in terms of it framing a kind of process, but being embedded with a kind of necessary, visible outcome that speaks to publics. So I was thinking about that as, the work in itself, that, embodying a definition or an understanding of art for me.
No, that's great, Harold. It was interesting what you said about just the term art itself, and I think a lot of us can acknowledge and recognise that art as a sector is predominantly white, and I wondered perhaps how, it's kind of a big question, but sort of how do we disrupt the replication of an art historical canon that is predominantly white? And I guess the zine in of itself, I guess, could be one of the disruptions that we do. But I was wondering if there was anything else that we can do to disrupt that historical canon.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly about, it's definitely, understanding the kind of history of the discourse. But I think it's also about, looking to kind of other models and really looking to other histories and other narratives. Because that kind of conception of art within the sort of, European tradition, canonical tradition, is so specific. And I think for those of us that have other heritages, it's often quite sort of baffling, because like there isn't really this idea of art. I think, I mean, I can just speak to my heritage, being from Ghana, West African kind of tradition, is that you know, art isn't this separate thing as a form of inquiry that has a kind of different status. It's like embedded within culture. So like the idea of going to a specific institution, that's where you see this high form of culture is kind of, I mean, obviously due to colonialism, there are museums and galleries and Ghana. I'm not saying that. And there's a very thriving, interesting, amazing art scene that's happening there. But I mean, within the kind of long history, you know, and even in Europe, there is that history that sort of goes back, you know, if you really investigate it, these narratives are there. But I think that's often a kind of, you know, you've often encountering these things because sort of there is an inbuilt kind of hierarchy, and within that a kind of supremacist ideology within art. It's the conception of art. And I mean, I think one of the ways for me has been that just really seeing how, if I take this particular definition of art that I have in terms of really thinking about, you know, art and more broadly culture, and again, that's also a problematic word, because it has a particular understanding within kind of like the kind of Western canon. But I mean that just the things that you do, whether that's multi-sensory things that you do, and I consider art, music, theatre, dance, textiles, clay, all forms, all of these, and more, and the crossovers and intersections of all of those things, as being, that's what your life is. You live your life through art, because that's how you make sense of the world. It's kind of intrinsic to who you are as a human being. But within the Western canon, it's almost like it's, you know, it's this kind of privileged space of knowledge and education that's rarefied, and that you need a set of knowledges in order to kind of access. And then through accessing them, you are an improved and more sophisticated human being through accessing them. As opposed to really recognizing that, you know, we're all creative practitioners, cultural makers. There's an opportunity perhaps to kind of critically think about how that might shape and enrich our understanding through shared conversations and dialogues. So for me, it's almost about really trying to kind of like think through the ways in which, and again, it's always problematic to use art and culture and apply it to, I think, other cultural histories and other cultural narratives. But that's something I've sort of been thinking about and sort of trying to do, is to kind of like, you know, what also are the forms and structures, in the way that I think you've provided a model with a particular reality, you know, what are the forms and structures that come from these multiform other cultural traditions and heritages, but, you know, not in, again, not trying to replicate those colonialists. I'm going to go over and, you know, so what's happening in Delhi, I'm going to, oh, right, we'll take that there. That comes from this, like, you know, Hindu tradition of, you know, whatever. So, you know, we've always got to be aware of that kind of colonialist imperative, and really thinking about how do we, you know, engage with these knowledges and these histories in respectful ways, but also allow us to try and move beyond the privileging of, you know, the kind of, you know, European canonical traditions and forms that we all still inhabit, you know.
We've got a question here from JJ, and they said, could you speak more about how you create/challenge models of art and culture through your work with organizations, educational, public and private?
Oh boy. I'm wondering whether I do. Like, there's an assumption within JJ's question, which is very nice, is that I do. But I think that question is one that I really, really do try and ask myself about. How am I, like, I mean, that is what I would aspire to, I would say. It's very difficult to maybe kind of quantify whether I do that. I mean, maybe at the just very basic level, it's just trying to transpose and share some of these questions, and then to facilitate a space in which other people's questions and curiosities can be drawn out. That's it, really. I don't know if I could sort of sit here and sort of claim that I've done this, this, and this, and this, and it's changed, you know. I just don't know.
Shay's got her hand up.
Harold, I wondered if I could help you out there, actually, in
Please.
answering JJ's question, because we met recently with another colleague, and we had a discussion about, I think, something that's implicit in JJ's question there, and it was incredibly useful to me. And it was something you said really stuck in my mind, which was around kind of the work we make, the things we do within a broader ecology. At the time, we were talking about activism. And in a sense, that's what we're doing here. And it was the kind of ecology, the broader ecology of activism. And I just wondered if you remember saying that, because it's absolutely stuck in my mind. And I wondered if that is something you could just briefly talk to in relation to JJ's question, because I think it's a really helpful perspective.
I don't know if I can remember all of it. I mean, I think maybe I was, because I do just spout off sometimes. But I think, yeah, I think maybe if I remember correctly, just trying to kind of allude to, if one thinks about an ecology, you know, there are specific roles in which people might inhabit or embody or perform. I think it's sort of an awareness of a kind of interconnectedness of some of these different approaches. Like, I mean, you know, we can have conversations about like tactics and strategies, and, you know, how in different periods of time, like a short-term series of tactics in order to deal with a situation, or a kind of long-term strategic kind of sort of aim. I guess something that I was aware of, because, you know, Joe and Natasha and I were sort of talking about I kind of activism in relationship to organizations, and particular organizations, and often the sense in which, like, where do you compromise, or taking particular stances and kind of positions, and I think maybe at the time I was sort of talking about, like, I have slightly more of a kind of pragmatic approach, really, which often means that I'm inherently kind of compromised in relation to institutions and certain ethical positions. And I think other people, I think, very necessarily as well, take a kind of needed and purist approach, and ethically very sound in relation to a refusal to be compromised by tainted institutions, or institutions with particular, whether that's kind of corporate links or environmental links or whatever. But the kind of need for that kind of ecology, you know, and also the need for a kind of conversation across those various kind of positions in which kind of people adopt, you know. And I think I'm personally more conservative, than I had to use that word, but like and perhaps more pragmatic, but also more compromised in some of the institutional positions that I have taken. But I really value those positions, that challenge and that insurgency and that questioning that comes from people that are, you know, are really sitting in those kind of activist models. I mean, there's a few people on the call here that I can see that, you know, I really, really value that holding to account, you know. So just that's what I was perhaps at the time maybe alluding to in terms of like a kind of ecosystem or ecology of, you know, and that's not to privilege one over the other. It's like there is a kind of interdependency, and you can see that in different political kind of structures, organizational structures, like that ecology.
Yeah, great. JJ's got their hand up. JJ.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit to that question, and to maybe ask you also to speak to your membership as a trustee on different organisations as well. And spoke just then about pragmatism, and so there is this need for different models or different ways of activism, and I believe that too. I think that that we take different roles in our work here together, and yeah, maybe you could speak a little bit about how your role as an artist, or as a black male artist on these boards, how do you navigate that? Because I imagine that you are not sharing that board table with other people who look like you or have the same experiences.
Yeah, more often than not, no. Although that is changing. I mean, Michelle is on the call, and we're actually on the board of Pavilion, which is an arts organisation based in Leeds, and Michelle has just been an amazing chair of that organisation for a long time. Recently, sort of stepped down from that role, but so we've worked quite closely, and I've seen it change quite broadly. I've been on boards for about 15 years in different various boards, and really that's a very particular thing about governance. The governance of arts organisations, like boards of trustees, are ultimately the ones that have a legal responsibility and that hold organisations to account in relation to their programs, their ethical standards, and yeah, again, there's still, I think, a long way to go in terms of sort of genuine kind of representation on those institutions. And I was talking about this on Monday when I did a talk for the Place, which is the dance space, where I was talking about kind of artist representation on boards, and a huge barrier for entry is that to be a trustee is a voluntary position, and lots of artists can't afford to do that. Lots of practitioners, young people of color, queer people, so it's kind of like, and all these institutions are like, oh, we need more artists, but it's like, well, actually it's quite a privileged position. It's assumed, it's almost like you're sort of a benefactor. Traditionally it would have been like, the elites that have that kind of sort of time and space to be able to volunteer, but actually, you actually have a lot of power. I think that's something I'm sort of increasingly aware of. So, but again, there is also compromise. You are sort of compromised, and you become really aware of how publicly funded institutions are subject to cultural, political, economic forces, and the inherent privileges of that, and and so it's not for everyone. It's kind of like, but I've sort of chosen to kind of to be in these spaces as a way. You're always a little bit naive. I think personally, I was a bit naive going into these things, but I know I really, really value, the energy and activism that I think is, I often see within art schools and universities. And that's a real drive, and sitting on these board meetings where we're sort of talking about finances and like, this grant here, or where do we get this money from? It's, I hear those voices, students saying, what's the policy on Palestine, Israel? What's the, these, are we really thinking, what's the environmental impact of the organization? Like, evidence it, so yeah, I think in that role, yeah, that ecology becomes super important.
Thank you, Harold. What you said was really great, and I think, yeah, it's that activism that still is present in those universities and arts organisations really is sort of the driving force to sort of taking those steps to making sort of solutions and sort of progressing our way forward. So thank you for speaking, Harold.